Hey guys, okay, so the Ancien regime, or the old regime, or ancient regime, was basically France before its revolution. Okay, so back then, France was broken into 3 estates or groups based on class. So the first group, or estate, was the clergy, or church, which accounted for only 0.6% of the French population. Now, they weren't super respected by the poor people, mainly because of something called the tithe, which was a tax that everyone had to pay to the church. The tithe was 10% of their yearly income. That wasn't a huge problem for the wealthier people, but to the less fortunate, it was kind of a bigger deal. Another reason why people did not respect the church was because of a thing called plurality. Plurality was when bishops had more than one job at more than one diocese. This would be fine if they actually showed up for their jobs. Most of the time, bishops didn't even go to the places they were supposed to work or preach at. That means that they got free money and a high status for doing no work, which is pretty unfair. The next estate was the nobility, or the wealthy families, who were only 0.4% of the population. So the nobility consisted mostly of the landowners, and they were born into their wealth and lived super easy, comfy lives. They were in high positions of power and pretty much ran the whole country. This thing called primogeniture was a popular practice back then. So all of the land and titles and stuff are handed off to the oldest son from the parents following their death. So let's say you're the oldest son of a duke or something, and your parents die. Then you become the duke and you get their house or mansion or whatever. But what about all of the other kids? Well, the daughters get married off to other noble families to increase their status. And the other sons were involved in something called venality, or the buying and selling of various offices and jobs. This could include military status, positions in the government, different positions in the clergy, etc. In fact, many French bishops were products of venality, which may have helped cause the corruption of the church and the plurality and such. The third and final estate was literally everybody else, accounting for a total of 99% of the population. And that's a lot of people. These were mostly the poor people, and they did not like the first 2 estates, who were rich without working for it. Meanwhile, the poor people were the hardest workers, and they were still poor. There were lots of classes of the third estate, like the bourgeoisie. They considered themselves middle class because they were educated, like doctors and lawyers. In fact, some of these people were just as wealthy, if not even more wealthy than some of the noble families. However, they were not treated as such because they didn't come from noble families, so they couldn't buy or sell jobs or offices through venality. Merchants could become wealthy and were in a similar situation as the bourgeoisie and middle classes. Next were artisans, like blacksmiths and carpenters and things like that. Below that were farmers who could own some of their own land or rent some land from the nobility to grow their own food and livestock and such. Finally, at the bottom were the peasants and serfs. They were treated as property of the landowner and forced to do the dirty work so the rich didn't have to. Another major concept during this time was taxes. The taxes mainly targeted the third estate, and this brutal system eventually led to the French Revolution. There was the tithe, or the tax on the land, but only the third estate had to pay this tax. There was also the vingtième, or a 20% tax paid to the state, but only paid by the third estate. Again. As discussed before, there was the tithe, the 10% tax paid to the church. This was paid by the third estate, as well as the nobles, but the nobility could afford it. Then there was the gabelle, the tax on salt. Salt was very valuable, as it kept meat preserved and fresh, because there was no refrigerators or freezers back then. Everybody paid this tax, but only the first 2 estates could afford to. The corvée was forced labor. Everybody had to either work for the state for a specific amount of time or pay it off through money. Of course, the top 2 estates could pay it off, but the third estate was expected to work. The third estate was expected to carry the nobles and the clergy, and they put up with it for centuries until the Revolution. The nobles ruled over France and gained their wealth by stepping on the backs of the poor. The clergy was corrupt in power and selfish in how they gained their wealth and strength. All in all, unless you were part of the 1 to 2% of the population that wasn't broke, you were done for during the Ancien regime. Until the French Revolution started. Then the tables definitely turned.